August 17, 1943. Charleston Naval Station, South Carolina. The morning haze clung to the harbor as German prisoners of war shuffled down the gangways after 3 weeks at sea. Among them was Feldwebel Klaus Richter. His legs trembled, unsteady from the Atlantic crossing, but his eyes remained sharp enough to process what lay before him, and nothing aligned with the 4 years of Reich propaganda burned into his memory. Across the bustling docks, white and black American workers labored side by side, loading and unloading cargo with giant cranes that looked like something from another century. Women in coveralls operated machinery with confidence, while children hawked newspapers at the gates. A brass band played lively tunes for a war bond rally within sight of warships. Civilians wandered freely near one of America's largest naval bases, seemingly unbothered by the presence of thousands of enemy soldiers. Richter turned to the man behind him and muttered under his breath in disbelief, "Die Amerikaner sind verrückt." The Americans are crazy. He would later write about this moment in his memoir published in 1953. The processing began almost immediately. Richter described it as the first impossibility. In Germany, prisoners were treated as assets to exploit or burdens to minimize. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged only when convenient. But here at Charleston, American officers read the Geneva Convention rules aloud in fluent German, explaining rights, even dietary accommodations. Red Cross packages were handed out, and Jewish American soldiers, men with surnames that would have been death sentences in Germany, explained that kosher meals were available for Jewish prisoners. Some Germans laughed nervously, certain it was mockery. It was not. Then came the medical inspections. Wounded Germans were given the same penicillin that was nearly non-existent in their own field hospitals. Prisoners with infections or injuries were treated with the same urgency and quality of care as American soldiers. A Swiss Red Cross inspector even noted that the medical treatment provided to German POWs equaled or exceeded that given to American servicemen. Even more jarring, some of the medics were African American. One German officer later admitted the shock of having his blood drawn by a black technician, a simple, everyday act in America that was legally forbidden in Nazi Germany. The shock deepened when they were escorted into the mess hall. Germans and Americans ate under the same roof. Not the same tables, but the same facility, the same food, the same lines. While German sailors picked up trays of steaming meals, American sailors nearby laughed at a baseball game on the radio, barely acknowledging the presence of their supposed enemies. The journey inland only amplified the disbelief. German POWs were not crammed into boxcars, but seated in cushioned passenger coaches. The train stopped at major stations, and civilians came to watch. In Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, German prisoners looked out the windows at American families, wives kissing husbands goodbye in public, children waving flags, teenagers laughing over milkshakes. And all of this happened just feet away from enemy soldiers under light guard. Even America's factories did not hide. In Baltimore, the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant sat wide open, its parking lots full of workers' cars, its bombers lined up in plain view. Steel mills glowed in the night sky, unbothered by the thought of spies. America was producing more than Germany could dream of, and they were not afraid to let the enemy see it. By the time the prisoners reached Camp Aliceville in Alabama, many were reeling from what they had seen, and the camp itself only deepened the confusion. Instead of straw pallets, there were wooden barracks with electric lights, indoor plumbing, and hot showers. Instead of bare survival, there were mattresses, sheets, and blankets. Recreation halls had ping-pong tables, musical instruments, even libraries. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Davis, the camp commander, spoke fluent German. He addressed the prisoners with authority, but also explained something almost impossible for them to understand. They would be allowed to elect their own spokesman, organize activities, even govern themselves within the camp's rules. For men raised on rigid hierarchy and fear, this sounded like either weakness or trick. But it was not. Over time, German prisoners began to experience freedoms they had never known in their own country. They were allowed to work on local farms, earning script to spend in camp canteens that sold chocolate, cigarettes, and even musical instruments. They labored at Alabama ranches, so large they dwarfed entire German districts alongside Mexican-American and black workers whose very existence defied Nazi racial ideology. At Thanksgiving time in 1943, the entire town of Aliceville mobilized to provide holiday gifts for their enemies. Veterans of World War I donated candy and cigarettes to men who had once tried to kill them. The camp served a Thanksgiving feast that outstripped anything Germans had eaten in years. Roast turkey, ham, sweet potatoes, cornbread dressing, cranberry sauce, pies, even beer and wine. The shock was too much for some. Prisoners cried openly. In that moment, many began to question everything they had been taught. Day after day, the contradictions mounted. They saw African-American guards command respect, even as those same men were denied service at local restaurants where German prisoners were welcome. They heard American farmers openly criticize Roosevelt and the government without fear of reprisal, something unthinkable in Germany. They read American newspapers that included opposition voices, mocking cartoons of the president, and reports of setbacks at the front. Democracy did not just survive criticism. It thrived on it. Slowly, the transformation began. Men who had once sworn oaths to Hitler started reading banned German novels in the camp library. Some took college courses through American universities. Camp newspapers shifted from Nazi propaganda to discussions of democracy. Prisoners who had believed themselves racially superior now worked alongside black and Mexican laborers who often outperformed them in the fields. Klaus Richter, the same man who had once whispered that the Americans were crazy, later wrote that the real turning point came at that Thanksgiving celebration. These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts. Their kindness was not weakness. It was strength. The strength of victors who knew they had already won. Not just the war, but the peace to follow. When the war ended, most German prisoners returned home, but they did not return unchanged. Many had come to see America not as a weak, decadent nation, but as a country whose chaotic freedom and abundance were its greatest strength. Thousands of them carried these lessons into post-war Germany. Some even returned permanently, immigrating to the U.S., marrying Americans, and raising families. By 1946, America had held nearly 378,000 German POWs. Less than 1% ever tried to escape, and decades later, surveys showed that the majority of these former prisoners held positive views of democracy in America. Many became leaders in West Germany's Reconstruction, playing roles in what would become the foundation of the Transatlantic Alliance. The story of German prisoners of war in America is more than just a footnote of World War II. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet power of example. America defeated Nazi Germany with tanks, planes, and ships. But it also defeated Nazism in the minds of men through something far simpler: humanity. The German soldiers came expecting to see weakness. Instead, they saw a nation so confident in its strength that it could afford mercy. They came as enemies. Many left as admirers. Some even left as friends. And that transformation, quiet, human, and profound, may be one of the most important victories of the Second World War. The prisoners who experienced American abundance returned to a destroyed nation with a revolutionary message. The enemy's strength came not from cruelty, but kindness, not from deprivation, but abundance, not from spirit, but logistics. Their testimonies helped prepare Germany for occupation and transformation. They had seen the future, and it tasted like chocolate ice cream served at mess halls during wartime. The transformation of German military personnel through exposure to American abundance represents one of history's most complete ideological reversals. Warriors who expected to die as prisoners instead lived to tell of American democratic plenty. Soldiers trained for total war discovered that material abundance sustained rather than corrupted fighting spirit. In the end, the recreation facilities in American camps achieved what bombs could not: complete destruction of Nazi militarist mythology. The ping-pong tables that operated while nations fought, the fresh bread baked during battles, the medical care given to enemies. These revelations transformed German understanding of American power in their own defeat. They returned to Germany not as defeated warriors, but as witnesses to abundance beyond imagination, carrying truths that would reshape their nation from militarist empire to democratic ally. The story reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but demonstration. That abundance can be more powerful than arms. That the way a nation treats its enemies reveals its true strength. The Germans, who could not believe American camps had recreation facilities, learned that democracy's greatest weapon was its ability to create plenty, even in war, to share abundance, even with enemies, to maintain humanity, even in battle's fury. Klaus Richter never forgot the moment his view of America shifted forever. Decades later, he would tell his grandchildren about standing on the deck of that transport ship, watching Charleston Harbor appear through the morning haze. He expected brutality and found mercy. He expected deprivation and found abundance. He expected hatred and found a nation so secure in its strength that it treated enemies with dignity. The lessons learned at Camp Aliceville traveled across an ocean and helped build a new Germany. Former prisoners became mayors, educators, business leaders. They spoke at town halls about the democracy they had witnessed. They taught their children that freedom and prosperity were not weaknesses but strengths. They built institutions modeled after what they had seen in Alabama. The camps that were meant to hold enemies became schools of democracy, and the prisoners who were meant to be silenced became ambassadors of a new way of thinking. The irony was not lost on anyone. The nation that had preached racial purity learned democracy from guards of every race. The soldiers who had believed in the superiority of discipline discovered that freedom produced better results. The men who had trusted in propaganda found that truth, even uncomfortable truth, created stronger societies. Richter often reflected on the cognitive dissonance of those early days. Sitting in a clean barracks with electric lights while German cities burned. Eating turkey and ham while his countrymen starved. Reading newspapers that criticized their own government while the Reich crushed all dissent. Every comfort was a condemnation of the lies he had believed. Every kindness was proof that the enemy was not what he had been told. The transformation was not instant. Some prisoners clung to Nazi ideology, even as evidence mounted against it. But most, like Richter, could not ignore what their eyes saw and their bodies felt. The abundance was real. The democracy was real. The humanity was real. And if all of that was real, then everything they had been taught was a lie. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. News filtered into Camp Aliceville of Germany's collapse, of cities in ruins, of the Reich's final desperate days. The prisoners who had once marched under Nazi banners now faced an uncertain future. Some worried about what awaited them at home. Others wondered if home even existed anymore. But the lessons learned in Alabama remained. Lieutenant Colonel Davis gathered the prisoners one cold February morning. "The war will end soon," he told them in his careful German. "You will return to a Germany that needs rebuilding. What you take with you from here matters. You have seen that democracy works. You have seen that diversity strengthens rather than weakens. You have seen that criticism makes a nation better, not worse. Remember these things." His words proved prophetic. When the prisoners finally boarded ships back to Europe in 1946, they carried more than memories. They carried blueprints for a different kind of society. Richter stepped onto German soil in July 1946, 2 years and 11 months after his capture. The homeland he found bore no resemblance to the one he had left. Cities lay in rubble. Millions were displaced. The proud nation that had promised a 1,000-year Reich had collapsed in 12. But amid the ruins, former prisoners like Richter became builders. They spoke at town meetings about what they had witnessed in America. They advocated for democratic reforms. They pushed for transparency in government. They insisted that criticism was not treason, but civic duty. By 1949, when West Germany adopted its constitution, The fingerprints of Camp Aliceville were everywhere. Freedom of press, independent judiciary, federal structure, protection of minority rights. These were not abstract concepts to the men who had lived them in Alabama. In 1961, Richter returned to the United States, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of the State Department. He visited Camp Aliceville, now closed and quiet. Walking through the empty barracks, he remembered the confused young soldier who had arrived expecting brutality. That soldier had been transformed not by force, but by example. America had won the war with superior firepower, but it had won the peace with something more powerful. The quiet demonstration that democracy, for all its messy imperfections, produced human flourishing that no totalitarian system could match.